Welcome to the Storypowers Podcast, a show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is John Zimmer. John is a sought-after international speaker who delivers powerful keynotes and helps organizations and individuals become more effective communicators. His clients include Nokia, Roche, and the World Health Organization. He also teaches public speaking in a number of executive MBAs across Europe, and his blog, Manner of Speaking, has been recognized as one of the leading online resources in the field of public speaking, presentation skills, and communication. John is such a nice guy, it's hard to believe that he was once a proud member of the noblest, most admired, and most respected profession in the world. He was a lawyer. But since he left the dark side many years ago, I won't hold that against him. Ladies and gentlemen, John Zimmer. John, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Francisco. Thank you for the introduction.
As I wrote that, I was thinking, are trial lawyers undervalued or underappreciated storytellers?
That's an interesting question, because whenever you bring your client's case to court, you are in fact telling a story. You are telling a story to the court, and you want the court or the judge to find in your client's favor. So the lawyers who can tell a story and obviously fit the different elements of the law to it, they are the ones who often have the best rates of success.
I was reading something the other day about this line you hear a lot in speaking, the phrase that pays, or, the one way to make stories and speeches sticky is just have a line that keeps being repeated over and over. And then someone mentioned, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit.
Yeah, it's that was from one of the most notorious trials in recent memory, but it's true. These phrases, whether it's in a court or in front of an audience, if they can go away and you have one phrase sticking in their minds, then there's a much better chance they're going to remember your message.
For anyone who doesn't know, if the glove must fit, you must acquit was from the O.J. Simpson trial. And so they had found these gloves, and supposedly they were the murderer's gloves. And then there was a whole bunch of shenanigans, I think, of O.J. squeezing his hands very tightly for a very long time because he knew the lawyer was going to ask him to put them on, and then they didn't fit, and he ended up getting acquitted. I found this out the other day. Did you know that O.J. Simpson was considered as a potential for the Terminator role before Arnold Schwarzenegger? And someone thought, no, OJ is not going to work. No one is going to believe him as a murderer.
I did not know that, and I can say that I'm very happy that they went with Arnold.
Yes. I think that turned out to be the right choice at the end. So when it comes to storytelling, and I've heard a lot of your speaking, I think it's worth mentioning to people that apart from the professional speaking you do, like me, you were in Toastmasters for a number of years, and you won 9 European awards.
Yes.
So listen to a lot of your stories, and one thing I thought it was very interesting is that you seem to have a very clear balance between telling personal stories, which I think you almost always tell, but also telling stories that are not yours and are not necessarily business stories. For example, I heard a keynote you did I heard the other day a keynote you've done in the past, and you mentioned the story of Osceola McCarthy. Mm-hmm. So this lady who ends up donating a lot of money, even though she was a washerwoman the whole of her life. And I've seen you talk about the famed Christmas truth during World War I. Do you have any clear guidelines to yourself about that balance? When do you use each type of story? When each type of story is more appropriate?
I always look for the right story for the right situation. And sometimes there's a personal story, in which case that's great because it's my story. It's part of who I am. I've lived it. But sometimes a story about a third person is the right story to tell. And you've got many speakers who say you should only tell personal stories. And I disagree. I think though, what must be the case, whether it's a personal story or a story about a third person, is that you, as a speaker, there has to be something in it for you. You have to feel close to this story. The story has to resonate with you. There's a wonderful article that I would recommend to your listeners in the Harvard Business Review, and they can find it online. It's called The Four Truths of the Storyteller. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It was written by a guy named Peter Guber, who is, or at least was, the CEO of Mandalay Entertainment. It's a Hollywood movie company that has made some pretty big movies like 7 Years in Tibet with Brad Pitt or The Legend of Sleepy Hollow with Johnny Depp, movies like that. And it's an interesting article because he talks about how speakers in the business world can use techniques from Hollywood to tell stories that make an impact with the audiences. It's called The Four Truths of the Storyteller. And he said a story has to have four truths. And the first one is that it has to be true to you, the teller of the story. So if I feel something for the story, if it gets me feeling emotional or it touches me in some way, then I know it's a story that I can tell to other people.
So then what are the other truths?
The other truths are, very, very quickly, the second truth is truth to the audience. There's got to be something in the story you tell that the audience can take away. I might tell you a great story from my childhood, but at the end of the day, why should you care? Why should you care about some experience I had with my father or my grandmother or whomever? But if there's a truth in there for you to take away, then that's a great story. A good example would be, companies these days, they hire keynote speakers to come in and speak to their employees about some things that they've done. And they hire people who've done amazing things like, I don't know, maybe they've climbed Mount Everest. How many people, Francisco, do you think are going to go out and climb Mount Everest after listening to that? I'm guessing zero. That's my bet. Nobody's going to go climb Mount Everest.
Especially after listening to
it. Exactly. But so why bother bringing them in? Well, maybe there's something in that story about teamwork or something in that story about overcoming challenges that I can take and apply to my life. So truth to the audience is the second truth. Truth to the moment is the third truth, which means you tell the right story in the right amount of detail for the right audience. If you've got a 10-minute presentation, you can't tell an 8-minute story. You've got to really boil it down. So that's the third truth. And finally, the fourth truth he talks about is truth to what he calls truth to the mission. I think of it as truth to the objective. How does the story you tell help the audience along to achieve the objective that you as a speaker have for them? So it's a good article, worth reading.
So I want to riff on some of those because I think this is very interesting. The first point I think is simpler, the truth to the teller. And I think, if you're choosing the story and you think it's a story that you want to tell other people, I'm going to go out and say that you probably have some attachment to the story, or you like it, you think it's a very good one. It'd be a difficult, strange choice to just tell a story you don't even like that much to anyone else. But the one thing I always say is, I don't want to hear a story from you that is not a personal story unless you tell me why you are telling that story. And sometimes it's as simple as saying, I heard the story the other day and I just couldn't get this out of my head. And then you tell the story. But as I've seen people do is they will tell a business story. And it was like, okay, why are you telling me the story? This is not your story. I could read this on the Harvard Business Review or watch on the movie. So why are you telling me as if it is? So I think that it's important to establish you as the guide to whatever experience you're taking your audience through, because otherwise it just feels a bit disconnected, I would think.
It definitely has to be connected in some way with what you're saying, for sure.
And the thing about the truth to the audience, which I think ties very neatly to the truth to the mission, is the way I tend to think about the stories is the stories are about how they make people feel. They're not about the facts around the story. So the story about Everest could be a story about overcoming challenges. It's not about climbing Everest. It could be, maybe your father never believed in you, and this is the thing you said you would do because you wanted to prove yourself. So it's a story about you and your father. It's not about Everest. So as long as the emotion of the story is relatable, then a story about climbing Everest can be a valid story to tell to any audience, regardless of, are they ever going to climb Everest? But I think some people don't get that. And then it becomes about, I've achieved this amazing thing in my life and I want to tell you about it. I'm like, but this is not me. Why do I want to hear about this?
Exactly. You're exactly right. And I think you touch on an important point in what you were just saying about what do you want the audience to feel? And you talk about the emotion of it. And whenever you're trying to persuade an audience to do something, there are two types of persuasion. There's the rational, logical persuasion, and then there's the emotional persuasion. And depending on how big the thing is that you're trying to get the audience to do, it may not be reasonable to expect them to take a decision immediately. They may need to go away and think about it and read the documents and do the calculations, and that's fine. But when you're in front of them in that moment, this is when you have your best chance to really connect with them at an emotional level, to get them interested in what you're saying, to get them excited about it. So it's an important point.
I've heard you do this in one of in that keynote that I mentioned listening to, the one you mentioned, Osceola McCarthy, the connecting you to the story or to the fact. You quoted Khalil Gibran, who is a Lebanese poet. I'm Lebanese as well, by the way.
I'm half Lebanese.
That's where, well, me too. That's where the Mahfuz comes from. And you didn't say Khalil Gibran, the famous Lebanese poet, said this. You said, a friend of mine gave me a book by this guy, and he said this, which I think was a very masterful way of doing the exact same thing, but making it feel a lot more organic than just quoting someone.
No, I appreciate you saying that. I'd forgotten that I'd said that. It's been a while since I've seen that's the video of that speech.
And talking about truth, this is something I'm coming to my own conclusions about it, but I wanted to get your take on it. So this is what happened. This was a few weeks ago. So I told the story as it happened. There's some dramatic flair. You change some stuff here and there, but what happened at the end of the story was that the message of the story was about how we don't often take time to think about what's really important to us. And we make decisions without that in mind. And sometimes that can lead us down dangerous paths. But in my story, I risked losing a girl because I wanted to go to a rock concert. That was the essence of the story. But I didn't actually lose the girl. So I had a scare that I thought my, good-looking friend was going to leave with her, but he didn't, and I ended up just getting a scare. So when people were talking to me about it afterwards, they said, yeah, but your message is a lot weaker because, you didn't actually lose the girl. So I would have changed that so you lost the girl. Something, like I know the line, don't let the truth get in the way of a good story, but something didn't sit right with me when I was thinking about that. And I wanted to get your take on it before I tell you what I'm thinking about that type of situation now.
I have a comment, but first a question. What was the band?
So it was Radiohead.
I
hadn't just gone to the concert. I had pretended to be someone else to go in as an employee. Then I hid in the bathroom for 4 hours. And then I had to hustle my way to the stage, pretending to be someone else again. And this was a gig I had been wanting to go for many years. So that there's a bit of context to the story.
I love Radiohead. As to your question, no, I would not have changed the story to say you lost the girl, because if you didn't lose the girl, then you're just lying to the audience. And for me, especially if the audience then finds out that it wasn't true, your credibility takes a huge hit. It takes a massive hit. I've done trainings in number of companies where I have people do speaking exercises, and I've had some people come up and tell stories for the purpose of the training. And then at the end, people love the story. And at the end, they say, oh, it's not really true. And you can just see, even though it's a training and there's no real harm done, you can see everybody feels a bit deflated. The way I think of it is, yes, of course, if you tell a story with the literal truth, nobody's going to ever want to listen to any stories because it's going to be too many details, too long, too convoluted. If you can stretch the truth, here's an example of stretching the truth. I went fishing the other day and I caught a fish that was 1 meter long, let's say. All right, maybe the fish was only 2.5 meters long. That's fine. But you must have gone fishing and you must have caught a big fish, if you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So coming back to your question, no, you did the right thing not changing the story. Maybe the actual story was not necessarily the best fit for the occasion. I don't know, but you're much better off sticking to the truth.
Yeah, my conclusion after thinking about it wasn't that necessarily that the story wasn't the fit for the occasion, was that I chose the wrong message. Because I had the story, I really wanted to share the story. And I thought this message worked well enough with that story. But then in hindsight, I thought, well, actually, as with any story, there's different lessons you can take from it. And I thought of a much more powerful lesson that fitted perfectly with the story. And the one I chose, I can see how some people go, oh yeah, but this is not really what that story says, or it doesn't say it as powerfully enough. I had a guy, another speaker, storytelling speaker called Paul Smith on the podcast a few episodes back. The way he describes this is he says, if anyone who was there when it happened would listen to the story and say, that's not how it happened, then you've gone too far in crafting it for the audience. I would join characters from time to time. It's like two people, but there's no need for two of them there, and you just make them one. But I agree. I think that you should be able to defend yourself with, yeah, that wasn't exactly how it happened, but if I told you how it happened, I'll have to be here for an hour. But that's pretty much what happened. Oh yeah, that's pretty much what happened.
Completely agree. And I've done that as well. I've had situations where I've combined two characters because it wasn't so essential to the truth of the story that they be two separate people. And this is a good lesson, I think, for people when it comes to storytelling. You can have a good story, tell the story, but then tell it again, try it different ways, shorten it, lengthen it, play with it. And as you've just shown, if you tell enough stories, there are going to be times when the story doesn't work or it doesn't resonate with people, or at least a certain number of people in the audience.
Just yesterday, I had Ted Frank on the show, and he does story-based presentation training using slide decks and videos and things of that nature. And he talked about this, I never know how to pronounce the name of this filmmaker, David Mamet.
Yeah, David Mamet, I think.
Yeah. And what he says when you're putting together a film or a story is look at all your scenes and remove one. If the story still works without that scene, then the story still works and the scene should go. If it doesn't work, then it needs to stay. And I think it goes for how you craft a story. Most of the details can go. They make no difference to the understanding. And then you need to make the story work as an oral story or a written story. Otherwise, it won't do what it's supposed to do.
I'm dating myself a bit with this, but I remember when DVDs came out. And the cool thing about DVDs was that in addition to the film, there were all these extra features at the end. And the one that fascinated me the most were the deleted scenes, especially when you would have the director commenting on the scene as it was playing. So the scene was playing, but you could hear the director's voiceover. And so many times a director would say something like, here's a scene that we shot. I loved it. The chemistry between the actors was fantastic. In fact, it was one of my most favorite scenes for the whole movie. But at the end of the day, it didn't advance the plot. It didn't move the story forward. And so we had to cut it. And that was a really good lesson to think that here's something that you love so much, but if it doesn't fit within the whole, you got to take it out. Writers have this expression, you have to be prepared to murder your darlings. The thing you love the best, if it doesn't move the whole thing forward, the whole novel, the whole movie, or the whole presentation, it's got to come out.
Robert McKee, who wrote Story, he said something along the lines of every single scene needs to tell you something about a character that you didn't know and or advance the plot. If it's not doing one of the two things, then there's no purpose in it being there. When you're choosing which story to tell, I think the story you choose depends on what emotion you're trying to highlight or what lesson. And I think some lessons are easier to highlight if it's not you, and some have to be you. So if it's a credibility, if your credibility is not guaranteed, you need to share a story that shows that somehow you're a credible person. If you need to assure the audience or tell the audience something about you, that has to be done with a personal story. If what you're trying to do is something that has nothing to do with you and perhaps would be awkward if it was from you, you want to talk about generosity. You don't want to share a story about how generous you are.
No.
Because you just come across like a knob.
Yes. I mean, establishing credibility with an audience, especially an audience that doesn't know you, is very important. This is why I love it for every time I have a speaking engagement. I love it when there's going to be somebody who is going to introduce me. And a tip for your listeners, if you're ever speaking at an event, a conference, whatever, and you know somebody is going to be introducing you, get in touch with that person and offer to write your introduction for them. They love it. Nobody has ever said no because it's one less thing for them to do. But more importantly, you then get to pick what is most important from your background for that audience on that occasion. Because the person introducing you doesn't have time to read your LinkedIn profile. There's too much information there. But you can pick 2 or 3 key things that will help the audience understand a bit better about who you are. And as you imply, Francisco, it's always better when somebody else says, our next speaker is Francisco, and he's done this, and he's achieved that, and he's done this. Please welcome Francisco, as opposed to you coming out and saying, well, I've done this and I've done that. It just sounds much better.
I heard this great way to be introduced as a speaker, which was, so the guy would say, oh, this is John Zimmer, blah, 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 blah. And don't let him get off the stage without telling his Madalena story or something along those lines. Like if you really want to get a story in there, just have the presenter say it, and then creates the anticipation. It can even be an easy way for a cold open. Because if you want to get into the story straight away, but is it going to work first thing out? Okay, well, listen, he said it, I might as well just tell you. And then you can start with the story you wanted anyway.
That's great.
Yeah.
Sow the seeds early. I like it. It. But yeah, personal stories. Then when you're on stage, telling a story, and especially a story where you didn't do so well, things didn't go quite so well for you. Audiences love that, being a bit vulnerable. Have you seen Brené Brown's TED Talk on vulnerability? You're nodding your head.
Well, I've told the story now so many times. I published a book on public speaking earlier this year, and it's called Bear, A Guide to Brutally Honest Public Speaking. And as I started writing it, I started writing a lot about vulnerability. And then I spoke to someone, I can't remember who it was now, but I spoke to a friend of mine. I said, I'm doing a lot of work on this vulnerability thing. I think I'm really onto something. And then he said, oh, the Brené Brown thing. I was like, what you mean? Who's Brené Brown?
Yeah, it's a great talk. But I tell people, audiences love to hear about your 5 Fs, the letter F, your firsts, your fears, your frustrations, your failures, and your fiascos, which are big failures. We could also use another F word if you'd like, but we'll keep it clean. We'll keep it clean for the kids. And of course, it doesn't mean that you're talking about all of those things, and it certainly doesn't mean that you talk about them from the whole time. But to talk about a time when you failed at something and what you learned and how people can benefit from your experience to avoid the same thing in the future, audiences love that.
Okay, so that was your firsts, your failures, your frustrations, your fiascos, and I'm missing one.
So your firsts, your fears.
Fears. Okay,
your frustrations, your failures, and your fiascos.
Okay, so that leads me nicely into the idea of collecting stories that I've seen you talk about. So can you just talk a bit about that?
Sure. I mean, knowing the importance of stories, what I tell people is to have a little booklet that you carry around, and you see something happen, jot down 1 or 2 sentences. Or if you're reading a magazine or a newspaper and there's a story in there that resonates with you, tear it out and start a physical file at home. Or for those of you who are more into the technology, you can use platforms such as Evernote to collect stories. And you start building up this repository, this bank of stories. And every now and then, just flip through it. Go back, read through the stories, read through the story summaries just very quickly. And you never know, if you've got a big presentation, there might be something in there that you can use.
And when it comes to writing those stories down, what do you consider to be important to write down? So what do you actually write?
Really, for me, it's not very much. It's just a quick 1 or 2 sentences about what happened, on the bus, woman dropped her package and man picked it up and gave it back to her. That's usually enough for me to remember all the specific details in any conversation that they had. If somebody says something and there's a phrase that really sticks in my mind, I'll write that. But it takes very little to jog the memory.
Yeah, I have this feeling that that is the case because you have been doing this for a very long time, and so have I, not as long as you. But for example, someone asked me this yesterday, how do I write them down? And I said, I just use the Notes app on my phone, and I write a line that reminds me of the story. And what I also do is I write a word or two for the theme or the message. So, for example, I had a story that, so the line that reminds me of it is punch clients in the face. And between brackets, I have "you are not alone," which was the message. So I have things like, friendship or leadership or whatever written there. So what I can always do is if I go on my Notes app and search for leadership, it's going to show me all the stories that I can talk about that are leadership. So I find that very useful.
Yeah, that's the advantage of electronics. On Evernote, I group things by different topics. So a story happens and I can just throw it under that subfolder. So I can immediately go to that subfolder and all the stories relate to that theme.
I heard an interview from Jim Cathcart, who's one of these legendary professional speakers. He's been around speaking for 40, 50 years. He's one of the guys that used to sell tapes, teaching people how to sell, or leaders or whatever. And he says that he has this piece of paper written on both sides with all his stories, and it's just a line or a word to remind him of the story. He says there's about 180 stories written on that piece of paper, and I don't think he has it in electronic form.
If it works for him. When I was in law school, through the course of a year, you read hundreds of different cases, and then you're preparing for the exams. And of course, you can't be rereading all the cases; it's too much. And so, what law students will do is case summaries, where you have the name of the case and the ratio or the main point, and maybe a bit of the facts. And what I found useful was, once I did a case summary, to do a summary of the summary in order to distill down to its essence. And that I found was a very useful exercise in helping me retain the key information from a legal case. And people can do the same thing with story files. You just distill the story down to its essence.
I guess that what we haven't said, but it should be the most obvious and important thing when it comes to collecting stories, is you have to tell them. And I've heard that it takes between 3 and 5 tellings for the story to move from your short-term memory to longer-term memory, and that's what I've noticed as well. I had stories that I hadn't told, but I wanted to tell. So I had the Radiohead story written down on my file, but I couldn't really tell it. I hadn't really told it, so it took me getting it ready to tell it, and I actually recorded it, put it on social media, and then now I could tell it forever, I think, because I've told it maybe 10 times in preparing for that.
You can definitely polish a story, and like you say, the more you tell it, the more it becomes second nature. So there are some stories you could phone me at 3 a.m. and you would say, "Tell me a story about X," and I would give my head a shake and wake up, and I could tell you the story because it's that deeply ingrained.
Something else that I think it's important when it comes to collecting stories, and I heard you do this in one of, I think you were talking about, this was a webinar on storytelling, I think, but you were talking about how you were working with someone who had traveled all around the world, and then you asked her, "Do you have any stories?" And you didn't get anything out of her. Oh, yeah. And what I thought, because then you described her, you didn't, and then I think she was having a coffee and she was a bit more relaxed, and then you said, "So how was your trip to Ethiopia?"
Exactly.
And I don't know if that was on purpose, but what I thought when I heard this exchange was, I said, I don't think the only problem in the beginning was that she hadn't thought about it enough or that you hadn't prodded enough. I thought it was in the question, because I know how my last trip was. I know how my trip to Ethiopia was in that particular case, but I don't have now I have a mental folder that says stories, but I think most people don't have a mental folder that says stories. So I've seen, for example, Sean Callahan, that works in Anecdote and has been doing this for, God knows, 20 years. He says that, so don't ever ask people, like, do you have a story or do you have an interesting story? Just say, do you remember a time when?
Absolutely. This is you're talking about a good friend of mine, Madalena, and to give listeners a bit of context, at the time, when I met her, she hired me to help her with a big presentation she had to give. She was at the time working for a big family foundation in Geneva, Switzerland, one of these big foundations that manages lots of investments and properties and things like that. But she was responsible for the charitable projects that this foundation was sponsoring. And this foundation was sponsoring projects related to mental health issues, helping people with psychosocial issues in countries that had been afflicted by war or poverty. So she'd been to places like Côte d'Ivoire and Malawi and Ethiopia and Lebanon and places like that, overseeing these different projects. There was a big conference, 4-day conference in Europe several years ago, where all these family foundations were going to come together, about 250 people, very, influential people coming together for a big conference. And she was asked to be in one of the sessions with 3 other speakers to talk about different charitable works these different foundations were sponsoring. And when we met, she was a bit nervous because she was going to be the final speaker. She was the youngest and she had the least amount of experience. And the others had prepared these fancy PowerPoint presentations. And she started thinking, should I prepare a PowerPoint presentation? And she only had 15 minutes. I said, look, PowerPoint is something that we look at the very end. I said, let's just talk about what you do. So we start working on how they picked projects, how they monitored them, financial accountability, auditing, all these standard things. And then at one point, I said to her, and this is exactly what you were just touching on about the S word. I said, now, it would be really good to have a story. And she looked at me and she said, I can't really think of any stories. And I didn't say anything, but as I'm looking at her, I'm thinking, I don't believe you for a second, but don't worry, I'm going to come a different way. So I said, no problem. Let's keep going. So we continued to work. And then, as you say, we took a break. We're having coffee. And I knew she'd just come back from Ethiopia. And I said, so how was your trip to Ethiopia? And now, because she's not thinking of the presentation and the need to come up with the story, the first thing she says is, it was really interesting. And that's when I thought, I've got you now. So just keep going. And she told me this incredible story of the first day she went to visit the mental health hospital in Addis Ababa. And I believe, at least at the time, it was the only hospital in the entire country devoted to mental health issues. And there are 80 million people in Ethiopia. So already I was intrigued. And she says, it was just pouring rain, pouring rain. Car picks her up at the hotel, drops her off at the hospital. Now she had to go through a tunnel and then run across a big open courtyard to get to the administrative office. And so she's in the tunnel, she cinches up her coat tight, and she starts to run in the rain. And she said she took about 5 steps and then she just stopped, because here in this enormous courtyard in the open were about 500 people just standing in a line silently in the rain, waiting to get in to see the doctor. And some of these people had been walking for days with their loved ones. And she's telling me this. And my eyes are like saucers, and I can't believe what I'm hearing. And she got to the end and I said, that's it. I said, there's your story. And so fast forward to the event, the other 3 gave their presentations and they all got nice applause. And Madalena stands up at the end, no slides. In the end, we didn't use any slides. And we worked on her opening. And the very first thing she said was, it was raining the day I arrived at the hospital. And she said 250 pairs of eyes just focused in on her, and she held them. And she said that afterwards, heads of these other foundations were coming up to her saying, I will always remember this talk. And it's a simple but a great example of the power of a story. And I like very much what you said about just asking people, so how was the trip? So how did things go? Because then they will think in terms of stories without using the S word.
The magic word I find for asking people about stories is when. It's not the only one you can use, but it's almost impossible to give you, you can give someone a date, but if you say, can you tell me about a time when you were trying to do something, just wasn't really working and was making you really frustrated? It's really difficult to answer that question without a story. You could say, oh yeah, I was trying to fix my computer. Okay, so what happened? Oh, and then you're going to get the story. But it's so difficult to say, can you just tell me about any interesting stories from the past 6 months of working here? Because I think a lot of people just don't have, what we have now is this appreciation for what a story actually is.
It's great advice, because stories, and you know this, stories are so deeply ingrained in our brains. I mean, they've been around a lot longer than PowerPoint and Excel. They've been around for thousands of years, people sitting around the fire telling stories. This is how traditions get passed down. And the scientists, they've done studies putting people in the MRI scanners and have them listen to a story, and they watch the different parts of the brain that light up, and the parts that are really associated with creativity and memory, they start firing up. And if you're reading them a financial report, those same parts of the brains don't fire up. And this is why people should tell stories, and stories do have a place. Of course, I'm not saying never show statistics, never show a graph. Those things are important too. And we could go into a whole other talk about why it's important to have that logical support for whatever you're saying. But the thing is, even in a business, even in what some people perceive as the driest, most boring business presentation, there are stories to be told. Even if you're giving a financial report, the numbers didn't just invent themselves. There's a reason that somebody did something or somebody didn't do something that resulted in these numbers. And telling a short story, and a story could be 15, 20 seconds. It doesn't have to be minutes and minutes. It can help people put things into context.
One of the scientists that has done a lot of this work that you mentioned is Dr. Paul Zak, who was the scientist who discovered oxytocin as the trust molecule or the moral molecule. And I had him on the show a couple of episodes ago, and he talked about how the story needs to have a dramatic arc for it to work on the brain. You could argue that it's not a story if it doesn't have any dramatic arc, if it's just an anecdote without any tension or a climax or anything of the kind. Some people would argue that is not a story, but we don't need to get into the weeds there. But what he said is, studying this, it was very clear that if you showed people, so he was talking about Super Bowl commercials. People watch the Super Bowl commercials, they think they love them, they will tell you they love them, but there is no real dramatic arc on the story being told in the commercial. So when he ran that through his software, predicting what was happening, and then measured people's brains directly, he found that the brain wasn't reacting to those stories. And if the brain is not reacting, then all the effects you're trying to get out of a story or of an advertisement just don't work to the same level. Talking about dramatic arc, well, that's actually a good point. Can you just give the briefest summary to anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, what the dramatic arc is?
Sure. And, if people want to see a great example of this on YouTube, if they go and search Kurt Vonnegut, The Shapes of Stories. And Kurt Vonnegut, if you don't know, he was a brilliant writer from the United States, very witty. He wrote Cat's Cradle, Slaughterhouse-Five. He wrote, some of them were turned into movies. Brilliant guy. And there's an old video where he talks about the shapes of stories. And basically, the stories that resonate with people are the one where there's this arc. And typically something happens, maybe starts out on a normal day, then somebody falls into a hole, or there's a disaster, or there's a trouble, and then they get back out of it again. And that's an example of
Man in a hole, isn't it?
Man in a hole, exactly. That's a simple arc. Another famous arc of a story is something that Joseph Campbell talked about in his book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, the hero's journey. And it's 12 steps, but to boil it down to its essence, you have somebody, an underdog, a normal person, they are faced with a challenge. And they've got to meet this challenge, but it's not easy. It's a struggle. And, there are ups and downs, but eventually there's a resolution, and they go back home with an insight. They've learned something, and now they're no longer an underdog or a normal person. They're a hero. And classic example from books and film is The Lord of the Rings. You have Frodo, the little hobbit, just going about his business, and he is the one who has to destroy the ring. And of course, you can't just take a hammer to it. You've got to travel halfway around the world and throw it into a very specific volcano. And it takes you 3 books and 3 movies to do it. And of course, there's good guys and bad guys all along, but eventually the ring is destroyed. Apologies to anybody who's not seen the movie yet, because I've just given it.
We could talk about how much it might be a plot hole that he had to do it on foot.
Exactly. But that's, so story arc it's when there's tension. It's when there's a problem. Movies. These are the movies we like. If you go see a movie and, it's boy meets girl and they fall in love and everything's great. And 2 years later, they're still together and it's great. And then 5 years later, they've got a family and great jobs. And 10 years later, they're still together and the movie ends. You're going to be banging your head on the table because nothing is happening.
Yeah, I heard someone describe this as what makes for a great life doesn't necessarily make for a great story.
Very true. Very, very true.
And now one way I have summarized to people the whole idea of the hero's journey is you have to go from pain to power. At the end of your story, your character needs to be able to do something that they couldn't do before. And they need to suffer. If they're not suffering, then there isn't really a story. And I also think the simplest dramatic arc that most people know, they might not know it's from Aristotle, but they know it's the 3-act structure. I think Aristotle's is normally described as was it setup, complication or problem, and resolution.
Yep.
Yeah. So Pozak talked about how you need this increase in tension that leads to a climax, and then a decreasing tension. And so that I think that's how he when he did the video that he normally uses for it, it's about a father who they show a bald kid called Ben. It's a true story. They showed a bald kid called Ben, and it said something like, Ben is really happy that he can play again now that his treatment is over. But Ben's father knows that the treatment didn't work, and Ben only has a few months left to live. And he's finding it really difficult to play with his son, knowing what's going to happen. But, how can he play with his son knowing that, and how can he not? And there's this struggle, and then the father decides to play with his son because, he might as well just do everything he can to make the kid's last few months as enjoyable and happy as he can. And that's the story. It's a simple one. It's a pretty sad one. I get chills from telling it, and that story shows perfectly that, in a very simple way, but that dramatic arc of emotion. And my question for you with that is, we can talk about 3 acts, we can talk about the Kurt Vonnegut's 3 main story arcs, The Man in the Hole, Boy Meets Girl, and Cinderella. I think is the other one he loves talking about, or he loved talking about. And what I find difficult with this, and also the hero's journey, and I mentioned Sean Callahan before. Just yesterday, I read something by him that he says the biggest mistake he ever comes across in business storytelling is people trying to use Hollywood stuff to tell business stories. Because what he believes is, if you're not working on this a lot, it doesn't come naturally to you, complicates things, and it's not necessarily how, you're not writing fiction, you're telling a real story. So you get all this information, right? And we know all the ways that the story becomes good or can become good from a Hollywood point of view or a writing point of view. But you're also telling people to just tell a real story. And the real story, as we said before, you should be crafting it for it to work, but you shouldn't be altering it. So isn't talking about all this stuff or telling people about this stuff, particularly things like the hero's journey, potentially going to do more harm than good when it comes to just telling the story?
I don't think so. And it does involve a bit of explanation. In some of the trainings that I do, the longer ones where I have time, I talk about the hero's journey. And then when I get to the end of it, using a movie as an example, I stress that this is a metaphor. That's all it is. And, part of the hero's journey, the hero leaves home. And I say, what could leaving home be in a real world context? Well, it might mean you going on a business trip, or it might mean you walking down the hall and speaking to a colleague in a different department. That could be leaving home. And when it's explained that way, I then give people a chance. I say, I want you to think about an event at work and then come up and just tell us the story, like a hero's journey story. And you might be the hero, you might be the helper, it might be about somebody else. Just tell it. And I've heard wonderful stories, very simple stories where people understand it. Now, is it possible that people can get so caught up in this that it doesn't help and it actually hurts more? Of course, but that's like anything else. I can give you a tool, and if you use it the right way, it's fantastic. And if you start using a hammer to screw in, a screw, then you're going to have problems. It's all how you use it. So I do think that giving people this kind of information that they can think, if they're serious about it, if they want to become good storytellers, yes, they're going to need to put in the effort. They're going to need to think about it. They're going to need to tell a story. Then they're going to need to tell it again and again and refine it and get good at telling the story. But I don't see any particular danger with it, because I think at the end of the day, we're all natural storytellers. We just don't think of ourselves as storytellers. When you get together with your friends, if four friends go out for an evening, you're going to have a dozen stories by the time the evening is done. They might be longer, they might be shorter, but that's what we all do.
Yeah, I've repeated more than once here that some of my friends are awful at telling stories because they've not, as you said, they are doing it. They're doing the literal truth. And it is painful at times when the story has gone on for 5 minutes and you still have no clue what's going on.
That is, we all know people like that who will go on, and you're just thinking, could you please get to the point? And that's truth to the moment. This is knowing how many details to put in. I could tell you a story about X, and then I could go into a business conference. I could tell the same story, but I'm not going to tell it the same way. I might add certain details. I might take details out. I might stretch it. I might shrink it.
Yeah, because you're talking about business context. So this is something that I wanted to ask you, because I've had this experience last year, but not to the extent you've had, which is teaching at an MBA. So last year I did a lot of work at YESE. I don't know if you've touched on storytelling as part of all the things you've done, because I'm not familiar with the program exactly. Because when I did it, we had a specific day that was on storytelling, and there was a specific project that was on storytelling. And what I wanted to ask you is, what have you found is either the most difficult thing for people to get right, or the biggest mistake they make in an executive? So in your experience with the MBAs, when you tell someone to tell a story, what do they really struggle with, or what's the thing that they typically get wrong?
I would say one thing that many people, not all, but many people get wrong right at the start is to think that they can't tell a story about a certain subject. And these often become some of the most interesting discussions in class, because there will always be at least one or two who say, no, in fact, you can tell a story and it's important. And you get this discussion. And this is where, I talk about the importance of using a story, something that happened that is concrete, that relates to whatever technical topic you're talking about is. And a fantastic example, I do a lot of work in Geneva with the World Intellectual Property Organization. And years ago, there was a presentation by a woman, a lawyer, who was talking about a treaty that allows people to apply for patent protection for new varieties of plants or flowers. People crossbreed flowers such as orchids, and they create these beautiful new flowers, and if they apply for patent protection, they can then benefit from the sale of these orchids, the same way that a company like Apple files for patent protection for its iPhone, for example. And she did something very clever. She had on a slide this long legal paragraph from this treaty that was the key paragraph that allows people to apply for patent protection. And she said, this is the paragraph you're going to have to spend time with. You're going to have to understand it. You're going to have to read the accompanying regulations. It's key. It's important. There are forms to fill out, to file, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then she said, but I don't want to take you through it step by step now. You can look at it later. What I want to do is tell you about its effect. And she changes the slide. And now all of a sudden, there's this full screen image of this village in Southeast Asia. I can't remember which country, but it's from Southeast Asia. And she talks about how they had crossbred orchids and come up with this beautiful new flower. And then a picture of the flower appears in the bottom corner. And she talks about how this village then applied for patent protection and they got it. And because of this, they now sell this new orchid. And because of that, there is an income stream coming into the village. And because of that, they were able to build a clinic for the people and put in a concrete floor in the school and lighting and get new books and desks for the students. And now, from that story, that very simple story, all of a sudden that long legal paragraph took on a whole new meaning because people could see the human impact behind it. And so my advice to people listening is that if you're struggling to think, what possible story could I tell in this context? Think about the context and then just keep drilling deeper and deeper until you find the human impact. Because at the end of the day, everything that we do, there is some impact on somebody at some level. And that's where you're likely to find your stories.
There is a line that I think is useful, which is something is happening to somebody somewhere.
I'm going to write that down. I think I like that. Something's happening to somebody somewhere.
And if you always apply that to whatever you're talking about, then there's a much likelier chance that even if you don't tell a story, you are bringing the human element in, because otherwise it's so easy to fall, particularly in the business context, to fall down into client segmentation, and this is the take up of the offer, and it's you just these abstractions which you can't really care about, because we don't care about abstractions. We care about people. So yeah, I think that line, I got this from Ted Frank when I was reading his book, Get to the Heart. And I think it's very useful, very interesting way to get to who is being affected by whatever you're talking about.
Yeah, no, it's true, because you see all these technical presentations, and then I ask people in the audience after, in trainings, how much do you remember? And people say, oh, no, we don't remember anything. And yet it's funny. When people are in the audience, they want one thing, but when they get up on stage, they think, no, I've got to do it the way it's always been done.
It's a risk mitigation strategy, isn't it? I've often told people that if you don't want to use PowerPoint, if you want to go up there and just talk and even, say, be funny, for example, if you pull it off, no one will complain, and they will like it a lot more than if you just did a competent presentation, the sort of the usual style. But if you screw it up, then people are going to go, oh, wow, you didn't even bother putting together a PowerPoint. So I think it's, higher impact, higher risk strategy in a way, but
Sure.
It's the one that I tend to advise people to go for, because it's just such a contrast from the sort of boring dross of data slides after data slide and data slides that are actually fine occasionally because you have to deal with the data sometimes, but they're just a bullet points.
No, and the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. You can have slides showing the data, that's fine, but then you can also insert a black slide where the screen goes black, people refocus on you, and you tell a short story that helps people retain it better. And then you can get back to the data as well. It's, balancing the elements of the three pillars of persuasion of Aristotle: logos, which is the logic; ethos, your credibility; and then pathos, which is the emotion. And without question, in the majority of business presentations, you're going to have more logic, more logos than pathos, but it doesn't mean that you leave the emotion out altogether. You can tell in a 30-minute presentation, you could tell a 2-minute story, which frames things nicely. And I'm willing to bet that people will remember the story more than they're going to remember any significant single statistic or number.
Agreed. John, this has been fantastic. It's just about an hour and it's flown by.
It has flown by. I've really enjoyed the conversation, Francisco. Thank you for having me.
So your blog is mannerofspeaking.com?
No, mannerofspeaking.org is my website. On it, they will find a blog that I've been writing now for 12 years and some other information about me and what I do. Another thing that I'm very proud to have co-created with Florian Muck is Rhetoric.
Our mutual friend, yes.
Yes, our mutual friend. Rhetoric, the public speaking game. We created a board game to help people gamify public speaking, and there's lots of storytelling involved there. And it's available as a multilingual app on the App Store and Google Play. It's in English, French, Spanish, German, Russian, and Catalan so far.
Having played it before with you, I think you were with me the time I played. It's the most It's the most fun embarrassment you ever have.
And it's a lot. What's fun, I think what's the most rewarding thing for me is having seen people, not you, but other people who are nervous about public speaking. And the first time they have to get up and speak, they're a bit nervous, but everybody applauds. And then they sit down and they feel good and they're applauding everybody else. And then the second turn, they're a little less nervous. And halfway through the game, you see people just jumping up, wanting to play. It's my turn now, because they're not thinking I'm giving a speech. They're just thinking, I'm playing a game. So, and it's an example of what you said earlier about telling stories and practicing and practicing and practicing.
All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves. And until next time. I hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, I'd love for you to subscribe and leave us a review or a rating on the Apple Podcasts app. It's very easy. You open the app and find this show. Then scroll down a little, and when you see the stars, tap. I'd really appreciate it, and it does help other people find us. And if you'd like to get in touch or find out more about what I do, reach out to me on LinkedIn or visit my website, storypowers.com.